Executive Vice President from EarthSat. Mr. Thibault was the NASA Principal Investigator for the Earth Resources Technology Satellite 1 and 2, which were the first two Landsats that NASA developed. He's been with EarthSat since 1971 and was VP at EOSat International in 1985 and 1986. And with that said, Mr. Thibault.
Let me first of all correct one of the introductory remarks. I was a principal investigator in the ERTS-1 and ERTS-2 programs. There were many. I understand that I'm being given a lot of time this afternoon. I'll try not to bore you, but I'm a person who tends to fill the time that's available. I have copies of my prepared statement here, and I'm going to summarize some of the important points that I'm trying to make. Also have some illustrations which I am not going to refer to. I have a feeling that if one is going to be speaking for 15 or 20 minutes, it's perhaps better to look at something attractive other than the speaker. So these are just going to be a series of images produced from Landsat, SPOT, AVHRR, and other data, and various processes that we've applied to those data in the business of applying satellite remote sensing to Earth resource management. The title of my paper is Land Remote Sensing and Emerging Technology. It is a young technology. It's been a frantic 20 years since the first Landsat was launched, and it's only 10 years earlier that the first meteorological satellite was launched. And I think those of us who have been in this business from the early days are sometimes frustrated by the level of acceptance or non-acceptance that this extraordinary technology has achieved. Nevertheless, with the advance of processing technologies and geographic information systems, the acceptance, the utilization of these space data for a variety of Earth programs is accelerating rapidly. Now I'm going to refer specifically to my remarks, a summary of them. If you have questions at the end, I would welcome them. If you see something on the screen that raises a question, I will try to respond to that as well. The Gulf War demonstrated to the military and intelligence communities what the civilian commercial users of Landsat data have known for more than a decade. Landsat and SPOT can provide accurate, current information on land cover, natural and cultural resources for large areas, for inaccessible remote regions, and can do so quickly and inexpensively. My presentation will focus on three commercial activities which we believe will be at the center of commercial Earth resource satellite applications in the next decade. Global environmental monitoring, mapping, and resource exploration. I might add that there are others, but these are the ones which at the moment seem the best prospects for commercial success. I've also included in my presentation some remarks on the use of these data by the developing countries. And today I might include in the developing world large areas of the Commonwealth of Independent States, Eastern Europe, where there are severe environmental problems and information needs which these technologies may address. Each of these activities will rely increasingly on satellite data, and each offers substantial benefits to the U.S. and world economies. Before examining these technologies, I would like to briefly recount EarthSat's experience in the Desert Shield and Desert Storm programs that we became involved in 1991 and 1992. My reason for doing so is that these contributions were made possible by vigorous private sector technological developments. In 1990, less than 8% of our business was with the federal government. The balance was with a variety of commercial and international organizations involved in resource discovery, management, and environmental programs. On July 15, 1990, EarthSat completed a major petroleum study for international exploration companies interested in the northern Arabian platform. The area includes all of Kuwait, Iraq, parts of Iran and Saudi Arabia, Turkey and Jordan. On August 3rd, following the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, we offered to provide the U.S. government with current satellite-derived maps of the Gulf area within 48 hours using SPOT and other data. We tried for several days to convince a variety of officials in Washington that this was a worthwhile endeavor, but our proposal fell on deaf ears. It apparently failed for two reasons. The government was satisfied at that time that it had adequate maps, or that it could produce them. And the government experts were convinced that what we proposed could not be accomplished in the time to be useful, and let alone in the time that we proposed, 48 hours. Having failed to uncover an interested agency or official, EarthSat abandoned its marketing efforts about a week after they began and refocused our efforts on our commercial clientele. In early September, early on a Monday morning, we received a telephone call from one of those defense officials that we had talked to early in August. He had apparently the day before gotten an animated call from the commanding officer in Riyadh complaining about the quality and inadequacy of the maps that he had. And the government and its contractors had said that in order to do what was required would take several months, and someone remembered that some fool had said that this could be done in 48 hours. And I guess the person on the other end of the phone was irate enough to cause the person in the Pentagon to call us and see whether, in fact, we could put up what we proposed. And they came about, and the task was a difficult one, but we agreed to take a shot at it. The first effort that we were involved in was to produce a series of image maps using the high-resolution SPOT data. These data resolve imagery. That's interesting. That is a part of SPOT image there. Down to 10 meters. France immediately, upon the Iraqi invasion, embargoed SPOT data. Landsat data were not embargoed because it was felt that the resolution was not sufficient to be of military importance to the enemy. But France did embargo the data. We, because we were working for the U.S. government, were able to get access to current data, and we flew one of our staff to Toulouse, to Paris, and on to Toulouse to acquire the data and bring them back. We produced 46 image maps at a scale of 1 to 50,000, which, when the maps you have are 30 years old, ain't bad. They indeed showed things that were not apparent on the existing maps, which had been produced by the British and by the U.S. government. We also, as some of you may know, were able, because SPOT data may be used to produce stereo imagery, we're able to produce a series of stereo images of the area of potential future conflict to be used by those who are responsible for trafficability and terrain analysis in the pre-response planning. That work was indeed done in 48 hours. We produced a series of images, image maps, stereo pairs. I almost fell asleep driving those products to the client very early on a Saturday morning. We indeed had to work around the clock in order to meet the deadline, but we did. We subsequently suggested to the government that we could help them perhaps in other areas, but again they declined, maintaining that they had the matter in hand. And several weeks later we got another call which said that they could use multispectral data, data beyond providing information that the Landsat imagery offered, but Spot did not. And we said yes, we could map the entire area using Landsat data. Indeed, we had much of the Landsat data in hand already because of the study that we had done for petroleum exploration. And that project, in which we produced 33 maps, a smaller scale, 1 to 100,000, we did in 36 hours. And again, we volunteered to sign on and produce anything else. There's obviously a commercial objective in all this. We're in business and saw an opportunity to do work for the government client we have not done much work with in recent years. And they declined, but a week later they came back and said that they wanted copies of those maps, which we had produced, and as I guess only the government can consume such quantities, they asked for 100,000 maps, and we said that that would take more time. But we were able, through modern digital technology, to take the digital satellite map files and go directly to a color printing process by satellite. And in 4 days, we had on skids headed for Riyadh 100,000 maps for use in the planning process. We understand that the maps were indeed used, and for that we're grateful. This capacity to respond quickly to the government's requirements was developed in response to the civilian commercial market demand for rapid service, complex products, and the highest possible quality. Typically, our clients want 48-hour turnaround, and so we have to provide that. Apparently, none of the existing government contractors and responsible agencies were able to meet the operational requirements of the Desert Shield courses. Let me add that our efforts were well supported by the government, and without their active support and participation, we could not have met our objective. URSAT's support of Desert Storm included rapid response, again, turnaround in 6 to 12 hours of satellite imagery. A lot of it was specially processed using techniques that we had developed for oil and gas and mineral exploration. Our objective here was to identify two things. One were changes that had occurred from the period early in 1990 to the current time, at that time, late 91, or late 90. And the second was to identify things which were anomalous, that seemed out of order. And without going into great detail, it is difficult in the desert environment to move Earth without leaving some observable evidence. And when one is dealing with multispectral sensors, that evidence is readily apparent. And so we use those techniques and a variety of proprietary software to identify things which were of interest. We didn't know what they were, but they were worthy of attention, and the government had far more reliable and accurate data to discern exactly what those things were that we were vaguely observing. Our contribution in that effort was one that is common to everything in satellite remote sensing. We were simply focusing on attention on those things which were most worthy of a closer look. And indeed, that's what we do in mineral oil and gas exploration. My purpose in recounting this experience is to call attention to the benefits of a vigorous commercial activity. It is not to compare what we did to what the government is able to do. Indeed, their capabilities are far, far beyond ours. But it is through complementary efforts that the technology advances, and we believe in the last 5 years has advanced dramatically. Now I'm going to speak to the three thematic areas that I think are worthy of our attention in the next 5 to 10 years. And the first is global environmental monitoring. This is a program which has received much public and government interest over the last 5 years. We believe it's an important, an essential program in the future of Earth sensing from space. But we think it is well complemented, and I think NASA and NOAA and others are recognizing this today by the continuing Earth observation programs, Landsat, SPOT, European remote sensing program, the Japanese remote sensing program, the Indian remote sensing program. If the EOS program goes forward as it is currently planned, it will be a long time before we will well understand the data which are collected and can take these data and develop the environmental models and the public policies to regulate man's activities so that our effect on Mother Earth is made more positive. In the next 20 years, while this research goes forward, much needs to be done. Deforestation, pollution are problems that are with us every day. And I believe that the Landsat, SPOT, and large resolution Earth sensing satellites will contribute to the understanding and regulation of man's activity in this period as we're learning more about the long-term consequences of our actions. We know that the atmosphere is being polluted, but we can today, with infrared, color infrared, visible infrared sensors, identify vegetative stress at the very earliest stages. Having done that, we, as we've seen in Europe, can relate that to sources of air pollution or water pollution. And we believe that the techniques, the sophistication of the systems, and the processing of the data will improve dramatically in the years ahead. I have included in the printed remarks some examples of projects that we've been involved in. I apologize that the quality of the photographic reproductions is poor, but it will give you some idea of the potential of land remote sensing data to address environmental problems. Landsat, SPOT, and the other Earth sensing satellites are a complement to the EOS program. They are a necessary part. I think that I look at EOS as providing evidence of the temperature or the fever of the patient, with Landsat really being a diagnostic tool that tells you exactly where the sores are and what needs to be treated. Mapping is perhaps the most important opportunity for these technologies in the near term. Most of the world is poorly mapped. There are ambitious efforts to do conventional mapping with large-scale aerial photography, stereo photography. But in the meantime, there is a real value to producing maps, as in the Desert Shield example, which show the current state of the land surface, which can be, because of their digital nature, integrated with other digital data and processed in geographic information systems. We're doing a number of projects updating a common USGS 7.5-minute quadrangle. We can update a 7.5-minute quad using SPOT data a day. The cost is $500 to do a better job, the job that the U.S. Geological Survey does, and update that map with all the topographic information. Requires 10 years. It requires perhaps $10,000 per sheet, and it's 3 years out of date the day it reaches to the street. We're working for a large utility company in the southern United States. They're trying to lay out their plans for the future. A map that's 10 years old or 5 years old in a rapidly growing area is simply of little value. So they're spending $50 million to build a database. A lot of this money is being spent on digital data, digital satellite data. And when they produce a map, it shows the streets where they are today, and that image was acquired days ago. That is an important opportunity. In the developing world, there's a critical need for a better understanding of resources, their location, and means of exploiting those resources for the benefit of those countries. Much of the mapping was done by the colonial governments, making it at least 30 years old, and much of it went home to London and Paris and other locations, so that the emerging nations often don't have the knowledge of their resources, which are sufficient to exploit those. The Landsats of the future, as I said, spot data resolves. The smallest unit it sees on the ground is 10 meters. We just did an image, which I unfortunately didn't bring with me, of Beijing, and the resolution from spot and data combined with Landsat data is extraordinary. We believe that by the end of this decade, we will commonly be able to acquire satellite data at 5-meter resolution and less. Second, or third major area that I want to talk about is resource exploration. That's where much of our business is. I think there are some common misconceptions about what one does with remote sensing data in looking for oil and gas or minerals. The techniques are very sophisticated. We are doing many proprietary things with the satellite data and combining those data with other data. And when we've done the best job that we can do, all we can say to the explorationists, to our clients, is that your chances of finding oil or lead zinc are better if you look in these areas than if you look in some other areas. But better may be that we have eliminated 95% of the area that they might consider for exploration. When one considers that the oil and gas industry spends on the order, in good times, of $5 billion a year on seismic data, it makes a big difference to know that your seismic line ought to be laid here rather than over there. And we believe that simply increasing the efficiency with which that one activity is done more than pays for the investment that we have in these technologies. Energy sufficiency will continue to be a driving need for the U.S. and the industrialized world. These technologies offer a great deal in addressing that need. I mentioned earlier the Commonwealth of Independent States. We've been doing a great deal of work in the remote areas of the world, those areas of the world which until recently, and some to the present, have not been accessible. Satellites provide access to the entire world. We did a project 3 years ago in Myanmar. It was for international oil companies. Myanmar is closed to the outside world. Though things are improving, the political situation there is improving. Satellites offer a means of examining the possibilities of oil exploration. No outsiders have been in Burma since the early 1960s, and knowledge of the potential is limited. We're doing the same thing in the Soviet Union. Our world, in terms of resources and the potential for resource development, I think increased twofold with the change in the political system and governments of the Soviet Union. Again, international investors who would do joint ventures with those nations need first to know what the prospects of success are, and we can provide information on that from the existing satellite systems. I might also mention that we work with Almaz data, that is the Soviet radar satellite data, along with any other data we can get our hands on. I think there is also a misconception about remote sensing that there is some magic, that one can apply formulae to digital data, spectral data, and discover the ideal location to place a well or to dig a hole. In fact, as I've said, it simply is a filtering tool. In the years ahead, with hyperspectral sensing, where we're able to have much higher resolution of the spectral data, we will be able to get much closer. But for the time being, we're simply focusing, increasing the cost effectiveness of the much more expensive activities that our clients face. Finally, I'd like to talk about the developing world, because it is a critical area of interest to the United States from a security point of view. It is of critical interest from an environmental point of view, and certainly it is in terms of human populations and our ability to support those populations. We've done a great deal of work for international donor agencies utilizing these advanced technologies to assist in developing agriculture in areas where the resources for agriculture are much poorer than they are here in North America. And I believe that we will see the greatest return in the next 10 years from these technologies in improving the environments of these countries, avoiding some of the environmental consequences of unrestrained destruction of forests and soils. And we see rapidly growing confidence in the handling of these technologies. Many countries in the developing world are ahead of the United States in using these data and technologies in the day-to-day management of their resources. In conclusion, I would like to say that I am most optimistic about the future of Earth remote sensing. I think those of us who have long been impatient with the rate of acceptance have finally passed that generation that usually is required before a technology is grasped and applied in the manner that its discoverers had hoped for. I continually remind those who get impatient with the place that we are that the Xerox process was discovered in the 20s, and the first machine in the mid-50s received little acceptance for a long time. It's interesting that fax machines caught on a lot faster. I think our receptiveness for high technologies is truly expanding. And finally, I guess I'd like to also say that the United States has enjoyed leadership in this area of technology. I think we've retained that leadership. And in the area, in the future, with hyperspectral data and massive databases, EOS and other programs, our computing technology is a cornerstone to that. And we are dealing, today we work with supercomputers that are the size of large PCs a few years ago, and even they seem slow, and we never have enough memory. Thank you all. If you have questions, I'll be happy to answer them.
Pulse track monitor, I have a question.
Okay.
Could you talk a little bit about the timeliness of data from, say, SPOT, Landsat, and Almaz? I heard a quote from Jim Frelk at the Office of Space Commerce that it can take up to months to get Landsat data. And how does that compare with other systems, and your thoughts at the time on this?
Back in 1985, we had a meeting of the GeoSat committee at Crystal City, and we were trying to, this was just after the passage of the Landsat Commercialization Act, and we were trying to ferret out what their requirements would be for this commercial program that was forthcoming. And they insisted that what they wanted was data within 48 hours. So that seemed to me to be absurd. Here's an industry that's looking at the Earth, and the Earth hasn't changed for their purposes in millions of years. In fact, if the client wants it in 48 hours, that's the time which he should have it. Our experience with the commercialization program has been that we ain't there yet, but we're a lot closer than we were. We have, in extraordinary circumstances where we're acquiring data from archives, our experience is that we can get those data, actually not extraordinary, we can get those data in less than a week from either vendor. If the data have to come from Toulouse for Spot, then it may take a little bit longer. The problem really is in new data acquisitions, and here the satellites, as some of you may know, don't cover every spot on the Earth every day. Spot, it may be, they may be able to point the satellite and acquire data within 6 or 7 days. Landsat in 16 days, so if that data is not in the can, it takes a good deal of time to get. Most of our applications, which require timeliness, rely on METSAT data, and meteorological satellites are acquiring data continuously. We do have a program, which I didn't describe here, which is entirely commercial, in which we are continuously forecasting worldwide production for the major agricultural commodities, and that utilizes very complex physiological models of the plants themselves, and we apply moisture and sunlight to those plants, grow them in the computer, and continually make forecasts as to what production will be. As some may know, we look to the U.S. Department of Agriculture for the official word on what worldwide production is. We're usually within 2% of their guess. We provide ours, our final year-end estimates 2 months before theirs, but we also estimate what their estimate will be, since the market responds to truth, and truth in this case is the U.S. Department of Agriculture. We need faster turnaround. We're getting it. The systems are being put in place. EOS will have incredible demands for rapid turnaround, since we're looking at environmental phenomena that are highly transitory.
That'll be like getting a glass of water out of a tidal wave.
I think so. One of the expectations, and the EOS satellite and its sensor complement has been downgraded, but I heard a year ago that EOS would produce more data every day than exists on the Earth today. Those data have to be received, processed, and disseminated to people who are going to use them in their academic investigations. Yes?
What's your opinion of the proposed two-tier pricing policy for government-provided resources data?
Well, I have testified several times before the Congress on this subject, and I'm on the record, so I'll try to recover some of it. I think that two-tier pricing is an administrative mistake. It's an economic mistake, and it won't accomplish the end that the Congress is intending. I believe that non-discriminatory access to data, and that's with respect to accession and pricing, is essential if the market is to grow. The policing requirements are onerous both on the recipients of the data and on the distributors. We face, when people ask me who my competition is, I always say it's the government, it's universities, it's institutions, and that's the way life is, and I don't want to change that, but I don't want to pay 10 times what those competitors pay for data. I simply think it's unenforceable, and I don't think it'll work. I don't think it'll be legislated either. the Brown bill does not mandate it, but it opens the door. I think it's a mistake. OMB has mandated that at some time in the future, we don't know when, all government-acquired data will be available to all consumers at the same price. So even if we have a two-tier pricing scheme in the short term, in the long term, its fate is sealed. Any other questions? Are there any areas? Yes.
How do you see the market for radar type imaging developing through the 90s?
Well, I attended on Wednesday a presentation by RadarSat International, which is the Canadian program. The United States and Canada have a joint venture in which we're providing a launch for a very expensive radar satellite that the Canadian government is building. I don't anticipate that the United States will enter into the civilian radar sensing business in the next decade. We have the European Space Agency and the Japanese Space Agency both have radar satellites in their plans. The RadarSat data will be available commercially. There's some question as to how data from ERS and JERS will be available. So I think there are other places that we might wisely spend our money, and those considerations are being made by NASA and DoD, who will have responsibility for the Landsat program in the future. Again, if you would like copies of my paper, they're up here. And I'm going to leave them all because I don't want to carry them back.
No problem.
Thank you very much for your attention, and if you have questions that you'd like to ask informally, you're welcome to, and information on where we are and what we do is here. Thank you.